So I watched Utopia in 2013 when it was first aired on Channel 4. I remember it being very different, very exciting, and I haven't watched it since then. I've forgotten a lot of it, I remember some of it, and I thought it'd be fun to re-watch it and tell you what I think now. Is it really as good as I thought it was then? The first thing that you notice about the show, right from the opening scenes, are the vibrant colours. There's a lovely blue cloudy sky which contrasts against the wind blowing through the golden wheat. And these vibrant colours continue throughout the show. And it gives it a really different feel, which I like, and because it's about conspiracies and strange and odd things, it makes the whole show fit that kind of genre. The opening scene is in the Doomsday comic book shop. Just as it's about to close, two henchmen arrive, and one of them puts down a fluorescent yellow tool bag. From it, he produces some lead piping, which soon attacks one of the customers with, and there's blood everywhere. There is violence in this, I'm afraid. The other henchman goes over to the shop assistant and asks whether he's got a copy of the Utopia Experiments manuscript. He says he's sold it. The henchman gets a name and address before everybody in the shop is gassed. We don't know whether they've been gassed asleep or they've actually been killed. The henchman says that they're just going to go to sleep. It is, however, where we hear the main quote from this series: "Where is Jessica Hyde?" Now that question gets asked a lot, and if I accidentally say "Where is Jessica Rabbit?" I apologise, but you'll see why I might do that. One of the problems with the start of this series is it has to introduce a lot of characters to you. And so we've already met the two henchmen, and next we meet Becky, who's trying to get some research grant funding around the manuscript. She tells us that the manuscript is about a scientist who does a deal with the devil for knowledge. The devil appears in human-animal hybrid, notably a rabbit. Hence I said about Jessica Rabbit. And the manuscript was written by Mark Dane, who was a delusional, paranoid schizophrenic. And then we meet Ian. He's working in an office. It's obviously a dead-end job. We find out he's about 28, he lives with his mum, and he's spending his time on forums. And the forum that he's spending his time on is called Utopia. And then we meet Bijan. I've probably said his name wrong. We'll find out when someone actually says it, so apologies again. I can't remember. He's looking through some pictures which are very similar to the ones we saw in the manuscript that Becky had. He actually goes onto a forum where Becky is, where Ian is, and another character called Grant, who alludes to be some sort of city guy with a Porsche and everything. But spoilers, we find out Grant is just a kid who's basically looking after himself. His mother possibly is a drug addict. Definitely there's a lot of alcohol lying around the place. The key thing is that Bijan has the manuscript part 2. And obviously everybody else on the forum is very interested about this, so they arrange to meet in the Black Horse at 8 p.m. And finally we meet Michael. He's in a rundown motel. He looks like he's about to take an overdose when his phone rings from his wife, and it looks like they're going to try for a baby. And then his phone rings again, and we actually find out he's being blackmailed, that he's got another lady pregnant, and he's an important civil servant, so they want him to do something. We see Michael the civil servant go with his boss about purchasing some Russian flu vaccine. Now his boss is really sceptical about this. He doesn't believe it. They've been caught out before buying vaccines that weren't needed. And he tries to tell Sir Conran that he's not interested at all. However, his phone rings, which leaves Michael, Sir Conran and a Russian gentleman alone in the room. And both of these gentlemen say to him it's his mission to persuade his boss to purchase the Russian flu vaccine. Michael disguises the purchase papers for the Russian flu vaccine and he tricks his boss into signing them. So his mission is now over, or so it appears. The kid called Grant breaks into Bijan's apartment. Bijan originally agreed to meet at his flat, but then changed it to the Black Horse pub. But Grant, being a bit of a tyke, he breaks in and starts to look around the apartment just as the henchmen arrive with Bijan. The henchmen have got a gun to his head. They find the manuscript part 2, so then they ask him the classic question, where is Jessica Hyde? He doesn't know who this is. They also ask him who else knows about the manuscript, and he says only the guys on the forum. Anyway, they walk him out onto his balcony and eventually he gets pushed off. Well, Grant sees this, gasps, they notice him, but what he manages to do is steal the manuscript, so now he's got part 2. Meanwhile, back in the Black Horse, we've got Ian, Becky, and another character called Wilson Wilson. We saw his name on the forum pop up a few times. They get to know each other, and as the drink begins to flow, they start to talk about conspiracies. So there are lots of questions flying around now. Who do the 2 henchmen work for? How deep is the corruption within the government? And also, who is Jessica Hyde? So the next morning, Wilson goes round to Bijan's apartment and finds out that he's dead. The police officer there tells him that it's suicide, that he had a history of depression according to his medical records. Wilson doesn't accept this and uses some of his hacking skills to look at Bijan's medical records. He sees that they've been written with a software patch that's only just been released, so he knows that they've been falsified. He tries to tell the police officer, but the police officer doesn't really believe him. Grant is called into the headmaster's office. He's recently had an altercation with one of the neighbours. He won't talk to the headmaster about it, so 2 policemen come into the office and they happen to be the henchmen. However, Grant escapes by jumping out the window and onto some trees before running away. Also, Ian and Becky have been arrested for some lurid indiscretions which obviously they haven't committed. After a night in the cells, they're both released and they get together to talk about it. Becky starts to tell Ian about the writer of the manuscript. He was in a medical institution where he was a model patient. However, after being on a set of drugs, he started to turn really violent. These drugs were made by Corvast. She goes on to tell us about her father, who died from Diehl syndrome. It's a relatively new disease, and it first arrived in 1986 from nowhere, and therefore there were suspicions that it might be man-made. After some investigations, there was no common links apart from one thing. All of the people in 1986 had worked for a medical company called Corvast. Becky shows Ian an image of the Diehl syndrome. It's a mutation from 1989, and it's very similar to one that's in the book, the Utopia Experiments manuscript. The thing is this book wasn't written until 1985. And of course, the discrepancy is the book was written in 1985 and Diehl syndrome didn't occur until a year later in 1986. So the policeman that was investigating Bijan's death, that Wilson had said to him that his medical records had been adjusted, well, he must have put that in his final police report, because one of the henchmen turns up and kills him. News breaks that Michael's boss has agreed to purchase £83 million worth of the Russian flu vaccine. Well, his boss loses his job over this, and Michael also has to defend his role in it. A new guy takes over called Jeff and calls him into his office, where he says, "Let's call this mission accomplished." The henchmen arrive at Wilson's house and they take him down to the fallout shelter, where they tie him to a chair and start to torture him. Now, this is a bit of a tough scene. They concentrate on the eyes, so they rub chili, sand, bleach into his eyes. Eventually, they hook one of his eyes out with a spoon. All the time they're asking him, where is Jessica Hyde? And obviously he doesn't know anything. He tries lying. He says he's got her address and that she died in an accident. However, they realise that he's making it up. Whilst one of the henchmen is having a cigarette, Wilson manages to break away from the chair, though he's blinded at the moment, and so he picks up the gun, and when the henchman returns, he manages to eventually shoot him. Meanwhile, Ian has found out that the manuscript was bought from Doomsday Comic Shop, exactly where we started this first episode. They go to the shop and it isn't open, so they ask around and find that 4 people died in the shop from a gas leak. Whilst they're there, they get a call from Wilson and they go and rescue him and take him back to Becky's flat. Suddenly there's a knock at the door and Wilson comes out brandishing a gun, blindly waving it around. Becky removes the gun from his hand and then goes and answers the door. There, stood on the doorstep, is a woman who says, "Hello, I'm Jessica Hyde." What a great way to end an episode. I've heard the question, where is Jessica Hyde, so many times. And usually with these things they drag on and on and on. Well, it took one episode to find her. I really hope this makes you want to watch this series, and I hope you're able to catch up with the episodes before the next rewatch.